All right, this is going to be the first of many, hopefully, online pirate lectures here. I have stayed away from doing this in the past because I kind of like lecturing in class, but under the current circumstances, this is what we got. You'll notice this is a little bit of a recap, right? We're going to start with Port Royal and then move forward from there. So Port Royal, right? Going to be part of Jamaica here on the southern part of it would be, I guess, part of Kingston, Jamaica nowadays. It doesn't exist. Remember, there's a earthquake and it slips into the sea. At the time, though, right at its height in the early 1700s, or I guess I should say late 1600s. Sorry, um, the one in every like three businesses was like a tavern or a brothel or whatever, something that was servicing these buccaneers, right? Uh, Remember, the Buccaneers are going to get going initially, right? You can't even see it on the map, but off the coast of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right, where Tortuga is. Um, that's where they're going to get started initially, and the term came from Buchan, right? The guys that were using the racks, right, to grill meat. Eventually, under Oliver Cromwell, the English will send an army and take over Jamaica. And from there, once England takes over Jamaica, we see the rise of the term of the buccaneer that we think of. Now, the Buccaneers are different, like I pointed out from, let's say, the gentleman pirates. We made a big deal about that. Um, but they're not quite the freebooters that we'll look at in the next set of lectures. Now, Christopher Mings here in 1659 is famously going to sort of help establish the fleet at the Jamaica Station slash Port Royal. Um, Remember, he was going to be one of those guys that started buccaneering, right? And doing it under the same guise that Henry Morgan's going to do it under. That the Spanish are always trying to kind of like establish um, ships and build the Windward Fleet, as it was called, right, to come and invade and take back Port Royal. Famously, right, he's going to raid Coro at Tierra Firma. Remember, Tierra Firma is that northern region of South America. And it says right here, hundreds of pirate captains and about 3,000 pirates at the end of 1600. So this place is going to be bustling with trade that is generated by stealing gold from the Spanish. The pirates, right, are going to be reliant upon the governor of Jamaica. Remember, we talked about the political support, right, that's always needed by pirates. Without it, they're not super successful. Early colonies, it says right here, didn't have enough economic activity. So since they didn't get money, right, through agriculture, eventually they will, as I put out right here, because of sugar. But eventually, or I should say before that, right, the only economic activity was the gold and stuff that was robbed at sea by these buccaneers. It says right here it normalizes piracy, right? That was just kind of the way business was done. Another raid by Ming here. Probably on that raid, Henry Morgan was a sailor on it, right? But not like a bigwig yet. Eventually, Modiford is going to come from Barbados, right? And Barbados was a little bit more high society. They had more upper class folks. They tended to have slaves. They were already doing the sugar thing. And so when he comes to Jamaica, he's trying to like rein it all in and civilize it. And so he outlaws piracy by the order of the king, but he outlaws piracy. And when he outlaws piracy, the Buccaneers, right, have no reason to be there. They get their letter of marque, they go out marauding. If there's no letters of marque, there's no reason to hang out in Jamaica. So they leave and they go back to Tortuga. The problem with this is the businesses that relied on that money dry up. But more importantly, when the Buccaneers were making money, their ships were always moored in the harbor, and they were, it was chock filled with boats. And if you have a sort of de facto navy and a harbor filled with boats, more than likely it's going to be more difficult for the Spanish to attack, and they're not going to want to show up. Without this, this leaves Port Royal open, right, to attack. So it says right here they're going to change their tune. They'll eventually come back around on piracy. So Morgan here, Henry, I will say Sir Henry Morgan, right? he sailed to Curacao, right, under Captain Mansfield. Mansfield's another one of these guys like Mings that's a sort of slightly noble guy from England that would lead these buccaneering crews. It says kidnapped Bristol youth, indentured servitude, um, you know, lesser noble that fought in Cromwell's army, whatever, right? We don't know a ton about Morgan. As you read in the article about Buccaneers by Alexander Exquellman, you'll understand that like a lot of what we know about Morgan um, was sensationalized because he was like the most famous pirate of his day. And so, like, he actually even sues Exquellman over his depictions of him, and especially the violence and torture that he sort of pieced out. So, much like I was saying before, the idea of the Windward Fleet, oops, that's what they called the possible invasion fleet from the Spanish. With that, right, he was going to get another letter of marque and he's going to sail out. He will famously, right, sack Port-au-Prince, Cuba. Um, when he goes to Portobello, which is in Panama, and remember that's the sometimes referred to as the crossroads of the world, right? Because the treasure train from South America would go through there at that time. Um, they're going to land down the coast from the big famous fort at Portobello and march up around the fort. And then when they try to engage the fort, the governor, right, will be all locked in with his folks, but he won't have brought in like the townsfolk. And so famously, Morgan supposedly uses the priests and nuns as human shields. The governor doesn't care. He shoots him anyway. Um, they will get a decent, whatever you want to call it, a decent outcome, a decent haul from this, this plundering of Portobello. They'll divide the loot up off the coast of Cuba, which is kind of common for these guys because Cuba was such a large island, it was hard for the Spanish to really control most of it. The idea of, we've mentioned this before, that if you got maimed, that you got paid a little bit extra, kind of as like a safety net, right, as like a social security type thing, which is eventually the freebooters are going to be very sort of democratic, which is what we're reading in If a Pirate I Must Be. But the Buccaneers were kind of that in between thing, so they were always willing to help these guys out, but they weren't quite as open, say, as the freebooters. So right, they're packing. They're going to plan an attack on Cartagena. Uh, I believe that's in Colombia. And in doing that, right, remember I mentioned this before. They get together their ships, and one evening there's a. Some guys say it's a party. Some guys say it's a meeting. Whatever, doesn't really matter. But supposedly, an ash from a cigarette or a cigar or whatever they were smoking at the time, kind of probably went between the boards and caught a gunpowder magazine, or what do you really want to call it, like a barrel on fire, which caused this massive explosion and killed a bunch of the pirates. Famously, though, Morgan survives, right? All the people on one side of the table were just basically tossed out of the ship, and the other guys were killed. This kind of ends that thing in Cartagena, but it does show yet again how a pirate's life, albeit, a little bit easier, was also fraught with danger due to the fact that they didn't have the same professionalism sometimes as the Navy. Famously, right, the attack on Panama, they're going to have to get out and track across the jungle. Um, Very similar to, say, Drake, right, when he wants to intercept the treasure train, right, and they see the ocean, the Pacific Ocean for the first time, all that sort of stuff. They thought they would find some food, but they don't. And eventually, right, they're going to have to eat their shoes and leather bags and whatever, and eventually they stumble across the Spanish. And this will be a massive haul of silver for uh, Henry Morgan. Sorry, brain fart there. Oh, I take it back. Not much loot. I guess what happened? Oh yeah, I forgot this was a setup for this. So what happens is, right, the people kind of knew he was coming, and they took a lot of the loot. Now he still got enough. It wasn't a huge haul, I guess I should say, in the overall scheme of things, because he had a lot of debts kind of to pay. He had a big army, but the overall number was pretty high. But per person, they didn't make a lot of money. So what's going to happen is the governor like had basically set bombs around uh, Panama, and so when he leaves, he's going to basically set it on fire. Think you know Game of Thrones, right? With the I forget what it's called now, but the green goo in the show that's super flammable. Um, and so what's going to happen though is this servant, right, that he sees with this key around his neck, he is going to capture him and interrogate him. And so I got this part of the presentation from the class I took at U of H, and this is where the guy would kind of go through all the variety of gruesome tortures that they would give out. So the rack, right, they would stretch you, right? We understand that idea. Eyes as big as eggs. They'd get a leather strap, wrap it around your head, get a dowel rod, effectively, right, and stick it in there, and then turn it so that you would basically squeeze people's skulls until they were super uncomfortable. The old hang them by their testicles, burn their face, cut off their ears and nose, kind of like, there's another lecture we'll give later where we talk about some other kind of gruesome things that they would do, but these were kind of the basic things. And the bigger point of this was that they would interrogate these guys, usually for information. And this is another difference that we'll see between the Buccaneers and the freebooters is that there was a purpose for the torture. It wasn't just like sadistic, right? It wasn't they were doing it because they liked it. They were doing it to get information, right? And at the time, it was common for violence, right? That's the best thing to put it. They would use violence in the government, they would use violence at sea, right? It was a much more violent time. Now, having said all that, Exquelmane is the source of all this, and so, as I pointed out before, Morgan will actually sue Exquelmane for defamation or libel or whatever it is. So, in the background, old Charles II is going to come back to power. They're going to bring the monarchy uh, back after the English Civil War. And in this, he will make a deal with the Spanish, right? The Treaty of Madrid in 1670, which legitimizes Port Royal. Before that, they've actually thought the English were going to give back Port Royal to the Spanish, but old Mings, who had been sent back to England and tried, right, for not doling out his portions of the gold, talks Charles II into keeping it. So deal with the Spanish is made, but the thing is now they have to keep this level of diplomacy. They can't just like maraud and and steal stuff from the Spanish. Morgan gonna set sail again, even though the governor told him not to. Because remember, one of the things Morgan would do is he would go out, be successful, then come back and kind of retroactively ask for letters of marque. This time it was going to be too much, right? And he's going to, as it says right here, he's going to get caught in the shift. There's a change now in the viewpoint of how the governments see the pirates, the Buccaneers in particularly. They see them as a nuisance. They have some peace with Spain. They have a burgeoning sugar thing in the Caribbean. The pirates now are going to be detrimental to that. So they want to end piracy, and so they're going to begin to offer amnesties, which is like a get out of jail free card, just to promise don't to do it again kind of situation. But Morgan won't fall into that. Morgan, right? He's going to go back to London, tried for piracy, but he was like a celebrity, right? Like Morgan was this dashing figure to people, and so he's even going to meet the king. Um, he's going to meet old Charles II, and be Charles II is going to be very enamored with him. He'll give him his knighthood, right? So he'll be Sir Henry Morgan from this point on, and even so much so when they send him back to Jamaica, to Port Royal, he's going to be the deputy governor. It says London wants it changed, right? It's not going to happen, namely because guys like Morgan are going to go back and be in charge of the government, right? And so they're going to have a pro-pirate stance, as it says right there. Sugar inflation, and he's basically going to let off his buddies, right? Which is yet again political support. So again, changing the stance, sugar plantations is more important. So this is the overall trend, right? Become a nuisance again, therefore a threat to commerce and uncertainty. And so with the eventual earthquake, so like I was saying, right, with Port Royal falling into the ocean, that's going to be like kind of the end of the buccaneering period. But really, the end of the buccaneering period is this shift, right, from pirates to being seen as hostile and not useful anymore, right? Even though Morgan eventually will die of alcoholism, uh, uh, while he was in Jamaica, he was really not a very good, administrator for the crown because he was giving guys slaps on the wrist. But after Morgan dies, you will begin to see the death penalty implemented. and that will begin to cut down on piracy. Now, besides piracy, we also have smuggling. Smuggling was going on all over the place. It's kind of one of the hallmarks of the kind of Spanish system. Uh, Remember, the Spanish plan was to not have like pirate hunters, to not send them out after the pirates. So you had forts or big fortified areas around big harbors, and you had the fleet system. The idea that you're going to have the ships sailing to protect the merchant ships. As it says right here, they didn't have enough resources to have like a fleet of pirate hunters. It was just not as a it wasn't viable, right? Pirates could sail away too easily. Um, Foreign smugglers trade with Spanish locals, didn't want to go to Veracruz or Portobello or couldn't. I should have made a map on here, right? But Veracruz kind of is in the northeastern reaches of Mexico in comparison to the Caribbean, and Portobello's in the center of Panama. But imagine if you were in Chile or Argentina or the southern reaches of South America, you're not going to want to trek your goods all the way up to Panama to ship them back to Sevilla or wherever, right? So there was a lot of smuggling that occurred with locals along the coast, so that way they didn't have to trade with Spain and they didn't have to pay the averia, right, the tax. Portobello fairs were the names that were given for the time when people would show up at Portobello to trade, and namely, this was when the Spanish silver train made it from Peru. So what would happen is you basically had this like get together, right? This fair where people would show up, have this intense economic activity, but also, like, say, a mining town, it also caused massive amounts of inflation. So the government had to institute price controls, which price controls always lead to more smuggling. So everything was taxed by weight, and everybody got the royal fifth, like I was talking about with the Averia. And the royal fifth, right, was that the top 20% went straight to the crown. And so they had to. The other problem that we're going to see is that um, the two things that they had to smuggle were hard to smuggle. So silver was hard to smuggle, right? And the other thing is going to be cowhides, which we'll look at here in a second. But the age-old way of doing this was namely by mislabeling what they were selling, which is still goes on today. So the idea would be that, like, oh, I'm not selling silks, I'm selling linens, and linen's cheap. Also, hidden holds. Think Han Solo and Star Wars, right? So they're going to try to sneak it by the customs guys, so that way they don't have to pay for it. As I was saying before, the big thing is cowhides, right? Those are going to be the thing that gets exported from the New World, but yet again, hard to hide. Uh, it says trying to mislabel silver, right? That's going to be difficult. Most mislabeling on shipping and imported goods. Now, back to the notion of sailing. The big thing, right, was that sailors, why did they smuggle? I guess is a good way to think about this. They were underpaid, and being a sailor was like low on the totem pole for society, right? They were treated like scum. They were paid poorly. Think of them almost as like kind of how society treats uh, the homeless, right? Or like migrant workers or whatever, right? They're the lowest rung of worker. And people had respect for the job that they did in the long run, but those as individuals, they often were sort of socially outcast. Um, and so it says right here, paid poorly, sometimes not paid at all. So a lot of this um, was they expected them to smuggle, right? So pay for everything out of your wage while on a voyage. So the idea was is that you're going to get paid X amount of dollars, but like you're going to have to pay for your stuff on the ship or your uniform or whatever. And so they went to sea to make that extra cash, bringing back whatever it was. So how did you do that? Well, one, you found something that was usually going to the New World or somewhere exotic, like say Asia, and you would have some sort of agent, somebody that would like front you the money to pay for the stuff to smuggle, and then when you got it back, you would then split the profits. Now, how did a lot of this stuff work? You bribe the officials. You pay off the customs officials, right? They were either corrupt, right, or it was an established fact that they could be bought, right? That was the notion. Like they remember the idea was an accepted practice because they had paid for their position, right? Like I paid kind of a fee or a tax to the government, and they made me the customs official. And then in turn, I want to recoup that money by being corrupt. and it was acceptable. The only thing that made it unacceptable was if you asked for like outrageous bribes or if you were arbitrary, like I'm going to take your bribe, but not that guy's bribe. That was the only thing that pissed people off. Now, one of the big things, right, and I've mentioned this before, is this I obey but I do not comply. Remember, the Council of Indies was highly centralized, meaning that like things from the New World had to go all the way to the council, and then it would go to the king, back to the council, then all through back through all the other functionaries, then back to the New World. So it took months for information to get back and forth. So with this outdated knowledge, if the king makes a decision like, oh, hey, we're going to outlaw this, that, or the other, or we're going to tax this, that, or the other, but then it makes it back to, I don't know, say it makes it back to Barbados, or it makes it back, I shouldn't say Barbados, it's English, but it makes it back to Cuba, right? And imagine they have I don't know, they have a depression or something going on. They're not going to be able to do whatever it is he says. And so a lot of times they would say, I obey, but I do not comply, meaning like, I want to do what's right, but I can't because of X, Y, and Z. This was also something that they would use when they were, being shelled by if they were being shelled by like pirates and forced to trade, right? I obey with what the government wants me to do, but I can't do it because of these reasons. So it says right there, real adjustments, real conditions call for adjustment. Transshipping. This example down here is very convoluted, but the notion is um, I'm going to ship something somewhere else first to then ship it to the place that it can go. So, like, a good example would be like during the American Revolution, right? um, Only trade could be done between England and America or the colonies, right? So what the colonists used to do is they would ship stuff to, say, Scotland, because the Scots weren't big fans of the English, but it was part of the United Kingdom, and then they would secretly ship it on from there to the Dutch, to Holland or France or wherever. And so that's transshipping. So in this example, it's like if you want to sell like some like fancy fish, you have to like ship it to some other country, and then they ship it back to like the guys in China or whatever it is. So shipping out of Lima to Panama, intended for Central America, secretly shipped out. What would happen is, yet again, as they're trying to make stuff from other parts of South America to get up to Panama to then ship it to Spain, they would just ship it to some other region and then ship it to Europe. As it says right here, 85% of transactions in Portobello are smuggled. So, yet again, the inefficiency of the Spanish mercantile system is going to be one of the big reasons that there's a downfall. Like they make $1 zillion off of the situation of basically subjugating the Americas for gold and silver, but they could have made like 50% more had they been able to enforce their own policies. So it says right here, this system exists on paper, but in reality, it was fiction. Not most of the taxes they were collecting weren't there, and everybody was kind of smuggling stuff on the side. Very similar to what we'll see when we get to prohibition. So the government, what do? They're going to up their inspections. Um, they're going to up the penalties. This is not, but they're not going to go as far to death sentence unless you're a heretic, unless you weren't Catholic. And so they're going to basically bring up what they refer to as the indulto system, which was a smuggling tax. So you basically, if they caught you smuggling, you had to pay you know, a tax on the goods that you smuggled. But as it says right there, you're able to keep them. So this would be like if you're watching Narcos or something, and they intercept Pablo Escobar's cocaine, and they say, okay, you're going to pay a tax on that cocaine, but you can continue to keep the cocaine, right? It just makes business more expensive. It doesn't keep people from doing it, right? And that was the side effect of this. But that's all rooted in the fact of the corrupt sort of nature of the whole system, and the notion of like, I can buy my job or buy my position, so if I get paid, it's okay, right? There's not that level of integrity in the system yet, which we'll get to. So why was this all happening? Price disparities, right? The idea is that like if you have the value of something, right, and then the government says, oh, we're putting a tax on it. Oops. And so the price is now here, right? So the price is high. So if I can then come in, right? So we'll say the value price here. And then if I can come in and smuggle it, right, and sell it right here, right? All of this is profit, right? All of that's profit for the guy smuggling. So that price differential is going to be uh, the big difference, right? And this is all the money that the people save, so they like it, right? And so at first, most people like it until smugglers get violent and organized crime and all that sort of stuff. So price disparities, the lack of a modern bureaucracy to enforce it, right? And then bureaucrats really having to deal with like real world situations and the lack of up to date information, right? Those are the causes for smuggling. So in summary here, the closed Spanish system was an ideal target, right? That closed Spanish system was the idea of the gold and silver coming out of the New World and really being funneled through the Caribbean, right? It's a big spot. We're gonna be kind of hypocritical as we talk about it, like we're gonna go back and forth on saying it was big and open or it was small. But in reality, everybody knows that ships are leaving out of roughly Panama and roughly the eastern coast of Mexico with gold and silver on them, so they become prime targets for pirates. Um, Limited area, like I was saying, encouraged tax. That trade and warfare mix that I've already mentioned. Uh, England, the piracy was the weapon of the weak, right? England couldn't go toe to toe with the Spanish because they didn't have enough resources. So what do? They hire these like sort of self contractors or buccaneers to fight them for them. So another example is like terrorism, right? It's like we can't go toe to toe with you and with our army, so we're going to fight this guerrilla sort of terroristic style war. Same kind of notion. Piracy is politically driven, right? This notion of the English versus the Spanish in the Caribbean, definitely politically driven. Definitely the notion of like we have to take our political ideals to the Caribbean to represent our, so we have a foothold there. Um, Ready source of pirates, the buccaneers, right? The holdover of those sailors, the sort of outcast people on Tortuga that become the Buccaneers. We talked about the aristocratic pirates or the gentlemen adventurers, right? Like Drake, Winters, those guys, right? Uh, Eventually turn into the Henry Morgans, and Morgan will be the high example of buccaneering that ends with the fall of Port Royal, and that'll take us to the ideas of what we referred to as the freebooters. Okay, they're the next guys we'll talk about. And so the last little bit was all of this was happening while smuggling was going on, and smuggling happened. Price disparities, and then the bureaucracy and the accepting of reality, meaning that we can't do necessarily what the government wants us to do. All right, so that brings us to an end of this section. I will try to get the other one made probably tomorrow, and I'll get that one up as well. And you guys have a good day.